All right, so you guys wanted to deep dive online porn. Heavy topic,
Yeah.
but super relevant. You've sent over a ton of sources, first-hand accounts, expert opinions, research data. It seems like you're really trying to get like the full picture.
Yeah, definitely.
One stat that really stood out, nearly a third of adults in the UK accessed online porn in just May 2024.
Wow.
Yeah, that's from Ofcom's Online Nation report. Pretty wild, right?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Numbers only tell one side of the story, though. Let's hear from Sean.
Yeah, let's start there. Sean's story is a powerful reminder that behind the statistics are real people, real lives being impacted.
Totally. Sean's story starts young, 11 years old when a friend first introduced him to porn. He was hooked almost instantly, watching it constantly, morning, noon, and night. He says it became as common as brushing your teeth.
Wow.
That image really stuck with me, the normalcy,
Yeah.
that he associates with something that for so many is shrouded in secrecy.
Yeah, it really speaks to the accessibility of online porn today, especially for young people. It's not hidden away. It's just a click away 24/7.
Right.
But as Sean's story shows, that easy access can come at a cost.
Absolutely.
He talks about feeling drained, lacking the energy to do the things he used to enjoy.
Yeah, this constant fatigue, almost like a physical exhaustion from excessive masturbation. Then there's the emotional toll. He mentions struggling with guilt and shame, even though he couldn't stop watching. It makes you wonder, is this just Sean, or is there something bigger at play here?
Well, that's where the UCAT study comes in. It reveals that 1.8 million Britons are watching porn daily,
Wow,
some even multiple times a day.
really?
Clearly, Sean's experience isn't isolated. This is a widespread phenomenon.
Yeah,
It raises some questions about the potential consequences for individuals and society as a whole.
definitely giving me a lot to think about, and we're only scratching the surface here. Let's hear another perspective. Courtney's story. Now, Courtney's journey is a bit different. She also started watching porn at a young age, but she talks about the lack of comprehensive sex education as a driving factor. It's like there was this taboo around talking about sex, which
Well,
made her more curious.
That's such an important point. The absence of open and honest conversations about sex and relationships, it can create a vacuum that young people often fill with information from less reliable sources, like online porn.
Yeah,
And that can lead to some real misconceptions about sex and intimacy.
exactly. That's exactly what Courtney experienced. She says porn became her go-to for information, but it ultimately led to a disconnect during her first sexual experience at 18. She felt like what she'd seen in porn didn't match up with reality,
Wow.
which left her feeling confused and disappointed. And just like Sean, she also talks about wrestling with feelings of shame and guilt.
It's interesting how both Sean and Courtney, despite their different backgrounds and pathways to porn, both end up struggling with similar emotional consequences.
Right.
It suggests that there might be some inherent challenges associated with relying on porn as a primary source of information about sex and intimacy, regardless of your personal circumstances.
That's a really insightful observation. So we've got these personal accounts. They paint a pretty compelling picture. But I'm curious to get some expert insights. You mentioned Dr. Paula Hall earlier. What does she have to say about all this?
Dr. Hall,
Yeah.
who specializes in sex and porn addiction at the Laurel Center in London. She's noticed a significant shift in the demographics of people seeking help for problematic porn use. 10 years ago, the majority of her clients were married men in their 40s and 50s. Now, she's seeing more and more individuals in their 20s and 30s, often single, who are recognizing the negative impact of porn on their lives and relationships.
Wow, that's a pretty dramatic shift. What's driving this trend? Is it just that younger generations are more open about seeking help? Or is there something else going on?
That's the million-dollar question.
Uh-huh.
I think it's a combination of factors. Certainly, there's less stigma around mental health these days, so people might be more willing to reach out for help. But I think technology plays a huge role as well. With smartphones and high-speed internet, porn is more accessible than ever before. And social media often creates unrealistic expectations and pressures related to sex and body image.
It's like you said earlier, easy access coupled with social pressures and a lack of healthy sex education. It creates this perfect storm for problematic porn use, especially among younger generations.
Exactly. And it's not just Dr. Hall who's noticing this trend. Lee Fernandez, a lead therapist at UCAT, another source you sent over, reports a similar surge in people seeking help for problematic porn use.
Okay, so we're seeing this increase in people struggling with their porn use, but what exactly does that mean? What are the signs that someone might have a problem?
Well, before we jump into that, I think it's important to distinguish between casual porn use and what's clinically referred to as problematic online pornography use, or POPU.
So how do we know if someone's crossed that line from casual use to something more problematic?
That's where things get a bit more complex. It's not just about how much porn someone watches, or how often. It's about the impact it's having on their lives.
So it's more about the consequences than the actual amount of use.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are they neglecting their responsibilities? Work? School? Relationships? Because of their porn use? Are they experiencing negative emotions? Guilt, shame, anxiety? After watching porn? Are they trying to cut back but finding it difficult? These are all red flags that suggest someone might be struggling with POPU.
It sounds like it's less about a moral judgment and more about understanding the impact on someone's well-being.
Precisely. And Lee Fernandez from UCAT highlights another crucial aspect of this, the dopamine trap.
The dopamine trap?
Yes.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain. It plays a key role in pleasure and reward. When we do something pleasurable, our brain releases dopamine, which makes us feel good, and motivates us to repeat that behavior.
Right, makes sense. So where does porn fit into all of this?
Well, porn, especially with its constant novelty and accessibility, can trigger a surge of dopamine in the brain. And over time, the brain can become desensitized, meaning it needs more and more stimulation to achieve the same level of pleasure.
Oh.
This can lead to a cycle of escalation, where someone starts watching more and more porn, even if it's having negative consequences in their lives.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The more you watch, the more you need to watch to get that same dopamine hit, even if it's starting to mess things up in other areas of your life.
Exactly. And that's why it can be so difficult to break free from this cycle, even when you recognize that it's becoming a problem. It's not about willpower or morality. It's about the way our brains are wired.
That's a really important point. It helps to understand the science behind this, especially when talking about problematic porn use. It's not about judging people. It's about recognizing the complexities of the brain and the powerful role that dopamine plays in our behavior. But before we get too deep into the neuroscience of it all, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the impact of porn on young people.
Yes, that's a critical aspect of this conversation. We've already heard from Sean and Courtney about their experiences, but let's look at the broader statistics. The Children's Commissioner for England found that a shocking 10% of children have seen porn by the age of 9.
9 years old.
Yeah.
That's incredibly young.
It is. And that number jumps to 27% by age 11.
Wow.
These statistics really highlight the pervasiveness of online porn and the fact that many children are being exposed to it at a very young age, often without any guidance or context.
That's incredibly concerning. I mean, most 9-year-olds haven't even hit puberty yet. They're not emotionally or developmentally equipped to process the kind of content they might be seeing in porn.
Exactly. And that's why Dame Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner, has raised serious concerns about the impact of early exposure to porn on young people's developing brains and their understanding of sex and relationships. She emphasizes that the average age of first exposure to porn is 13. And she's particularly worried about the availability of violent and degrading content on social media platforms.
That's a terrifying thought. So what can we do to protect young people from these harmful influences? I mean, banning the internet isn't exactly a viable option.
Well, D'Souza advocates for high-quality, realistic relationship and sex education. As the crucial countermeasure,
Okay.
she believes that by providing young people with accurate and age-appropriate information about sex and relationships, we can help them develop a healthier understanding of these topics and make more informed choices.
It makes sense. If we're not providing them with the tools and knowledge they need, they're going to seek information elsewhere. And that's where things can get risky.
Absolutely. And this is where another expert from your sources, Silva Neves, a psychotherapist specializing in compulsive sexual behaviors, chimes in. He strongly believes that the lack of quality sex education is a major factor driving young people to seek information from unreliable sources, like porn.
So we're back to that point about filling the vacuum.
Precisely. And Neves doesn't hold back when describing the potential consequences. He uses vivid imagery to illustrate how porn often depicts unrealistic scenarios. Things like hairless vulvas, 9-inch penises, and prolonged intercourse, all of which can create distorted perceptions of sex and intimacy.
It's like they're being fed this fantasy version of sex that has little to do with reality, and then they're left trying to reconcile these unrealistic expectations with their own experiences, which can be incredibly confusing and frustrating.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to Courtney's story, her early exposure to porn and the lack of comprehensive sex education contributed to the disconnect she felt during her first sexual experience.
Right.
It's a powerful reminder of the importance of providing young people with accurate and realistic information about sex and relationships.
So it seems like we're starting to see a common thread here. Early exposure to porn, coupled with inadequate sex education, can have a significant impact on young people's understanding of sex, relationships, and even their own bodies. But before we go any further down this path, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are also potential benefits to porn. I mean, you included some research from the BBFC that suggests porn can actually help young people explore and understand their sexuality.
That's a very valid point. It's crucial to recognize that this is a complex issue with a range of perspectives. And the BBFC research does suggest that porn can play a role in helping young people understand their own desires and explore their sexuality. It's not inherently good or bad. It's about how it's used and the context in which it's consumed.
Okay, so it's not about demonizing porn entirely, but rather understanding the potential risks and benefits, and promoting a more balanced and informed approach.
Exactly. And Lee Fernandez makes a great point about this. He says a healthy relationship with porn exists when an individual retains the power of choice. Problematic use arises when porn consumption becomes compulsive and starts interfering with daily life.
It's about recognizing the difference between enjoying something and being controlled by it.
Precisely. It's about maintaining a sense of agency and balance. And that brings us back to the concept of POPU, where porn use becomes problematic when it starts negatively impacting someone's life.
Right, so we're not just talking about the amount of porn someone watches, but rather the consequences of that use. But before we delve deeper into POPU and its effects, let's take a step back and consider the broader societal implications of online porn.
It's a fascinating and often contentious area. Online porn has become so ingrained in our culture that it's hard to ignore its influence on our perceptions of sex, relationships, and even our own bodies.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's like this elephant in the room that we're only just starting to acknowledge. So where do we even begin to unpack the societal impact of something so pervasive?
Well, one approach is to look at the argument suggesting that porn can be harmful, not just on an individual level, as we've already discussed, but also on a societal level.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What are some of the key arguments against porn from a societal perspective?
One major concern is the objectification of women. Critics argue that porn often portrays women as mere objects for male pleasure, reducing them to body parts, and reinforcing harmful gender stereotypes.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly bombarded with images that objectify women, it's bound to have an impact on how you view women in real life.
Exactly. And this ties into another concern, the promotion of unrealistic beauty standards. Porn often features highly stylized and airbrushed bodies, setting unrealistic expectations for both men and women.
Right.
This can lead to body image issues, eating disorders, and a general dissatisfaction with one's own appearance.
It's like we're being sold this fantasy version of what bodies should look like, and it's making us feel inadequate in comparison.
Precisely. And then there's the issue of violence against women. Some critics argue that porn normalizes and even glorifies violence against women, contributing to a culture where such violence is more likely to occur.
That's a pretty serious accusation. Is there evidence to support that claim?
It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
And there's definitely debate about the extent to which porn directly contributes to violence against women. However, research has shown that exposure to violent pornography can increase men's acceptance of violence against women and their likelihood of engaging in aggressive behavior.
So while it might not be a direct cause and effect relationship, there's definitely a correlation there that we need to be aware of.
Absolutely. And we can't ignore the feminist perspective on this issue. Feminist scholars and activists have long been critical of porn, arguing that it's a product of and contributor to patriarchal power structures that perpetuate the subordination of women.
So from a feminist perspective, it's not just about individual choices. It's about the broader societal structures that shape those choices.
Exactly. They see porn as reinforcing harmful gender roles and contributing to a culture where women are viewed as objects to be controlled and exploited. And they often point to the exploitation and abuse that can occur within the porn industry itself.
That's a really important point to consider. It's easy to get caught up in the individual's right to choose what they watch, but we also need to acknowledge the potential systemic harms that the porn industry can perpetuate.
Precisely. And this is where the conversation gets really interesting, because it's not a one-sided debate. There are also strong arguments in favor of porn, emphasizing its potential benefits and advocating for greater freedom of expression.
Okay, so let's hear the other side of the story. What are some of the key arguments in support of porn?
Proponents of porn often highlight its potential to empower individuals to explore their sexuality and experiment with different desires.
Hmm.
They argue that porn can be a source of sexual pleasure and a way to learn about different sexual practices.
So it's about giving people the freedom to explore their sexuality without shame or judgment.
Exactly. And they emphasize the importance of distinguishing between ethical and unethical porn, supporting studios and performers who prioritize consent, safety, and fair labor practices.
That makes sense. Just like any industry, there are good actors and bad actors.
Right. And they argue that attempts to censor or ban porn are ultimately futile and infringe on individual liberties. They believe that adults should have the right to choose what they watch without government interference.
So it's about freedom of choice and personal autonomy.
Exactly. And they often point to the fact that people have been consuming pornography in various forms for centuries, long before the internet made it so readily available.
Right.
They argue that it's a natural part of human sexuality, and that trying to suppress it is ultimately counterproductive.
So we've got these two opposing viewpoints, both with valid points. On the one hand, we have concerns about objectification, unrealistic expectations, and the potential for harm. On the other hand, we have arguments about freedom of expression, personal empowerment, and the naturalness of human sexuality. It's like we're caught in this ethical tug of war.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? Finding that balance between acknowledging the potential harms and respecting individual liberties. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So how do we as a society navigate this complex landscape responsibly? I mean, where do we even begin to have these conversations?
Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge the complexity of the issue and move away from simplistic narratives that either demonize or glorify porn. We need to create spaces for open and honest dialogue, where diverse perspectives can be heard and debated respectfully.
I agree. We need to move beyond the shouting matches and start listening to each other.
Exactly. And we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases. It's about approaching this topic with intellectual humility and a genuine desire to understand the nuances of the debate.
Okay, so open dialogue, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge our own biases. What else?
Well, I think education is key. We need to provide comprehensive sex education that goes beyond the basics of reproduction and contraception. We need to talk about consent, healthy relationships, body image, and the impact of media on our perceptions of sex and intimacy.
It's about giving young people the tools and knowledge they need to navigate this complex landscape safely and responsibly.
Precisely. And we need to support research that explores the impact of porn on individuals and society. We need more data to inform our decisions and policies.
So research, education, and open dialogue. It sounds like a tall order, but it's essential if we want to have a healthy and informed conversation about this issue.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this is an evolving conversation. The landscape of online porn is constantly changing, so we need to be adaptable and willing to adjust our approaches as needed.
That's a great point. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's about staying informed, being open to different perspectives, and having those difficult conversations.
Speaking of difficult conversations, let's circle back to Sean and Courtney's stories. They both talked about the negative consequences of their porn use, but they also took steps to address their struggles. What can we learn from their experiences? Their stories highlight the importance of seeking help and support when needed. Both Sean and Courtney eventually realized that their porn use was becoming problematic and took steps to change their behavior.
So it's not about judging or shaming people, but rather offering compassion and support.
Exactly. And their experiences show that it's possible to break free from the cycle of problematic porn use and develop healthier relationships with yourself and others.
That's a really encouraging message. So what specific steps did they take to address their struggles?
Courtney chose to become celibate in her early 20s and has committed to abstinence until after her wedding with her fiancé. It was a personal decision she made to reclaim control and develop a healthier understanding of sex and intimacy.
So she took a complete break from both sex and porn to reassess her relationship with these topics.
Exactly. And for Sean, giving up porn was one of the best decisions he ever made. He says it's allowed him to reconnect with people he loves and cares about, something he felt he was losing sight of during his period of excessive use.
That's powerful. He recognized that his porn use was creating a barrier between him and the people he cared about, and he made the conscious decision to prioritize those relationships.
Precisely. And it's important to note that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to recovery. What worked for Sean and Courtney might not work for everyone. The key is to find what works best for you and to seek professional guidance if needed.
So there's hope for those struggling with problematic porn use. They're not alone. And there are resources available to help them find their way back to a healthier place. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more aspect of the societal impact of porn. We've talked about the individual and societal impacts, but what about the impact of porn on young men specifically? That's a conversation I think is often overlooked.
That's a crucial aspect to consider. There's a growing concern that early and frequent exposure to porn can have a particularly profound impact on young men's development, shaping their expectations about sex, relationships, and even their own bodies.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you're a young guy and your primary source of information about sex is coming from porn, it's bound to create some distorted presumptions.
Exactly, and that's what we're seeing in some of the research. Studies have shown that young men who consume porn frequently are more likely to have unrealistic expectations about women's bodies and sexual performance. They may also develop a more performance-oriented view of sex, focusing on achieving orgasm rather than intimacy and connection.
So it's like they're learning about sex from a source that's primarily focused on visual stimulation and male pleasure, rather than a more holistic view of intimacy and relationships.
Precisely. And this can lead to difficulties in forming and maintaining healthy relationships. They might struggle to connect with women on an emotional level, or they might feel pressured to perform sexually in a way that doesn't feel authentic or enjoyable.
Right. It's almost like they're trying to live up to a script that's been written by the porn industry, rather than figuring out what feels good and right for them.
And that can be incredibly damaging to their self-esteem and sense of self-worth. If they're constantly comparing themselves to the unrealistic standards they see in porn, they're likely to feel inadequate and insecure.
So it's not just about their views on women and sex, it's also about their own sense of masculinity and what it means to be a man.
Absolutely. And this ties into the broader conversation about gender roles and expectations. Porn often reinforces traditional masculine stereotypes: dominance, aggression, emotional detachment, which can be harmful to both men and women.
It's like they're being taught that this is what it means to be a man, and anything else is somehow weak or feminine.
And that can create a lot of internal conflict and pressure for young men. They might feel like they have to suppress their emotions or act in a certain way to be accepted.
So how do we help young men navigate these challenges? I mean, it's not like we can just tell them to stop watching porn. That's not realistic.
You're right, prohibition rarely works. It's about promoting a more critical and informed approach to porn consumption. We need to teach young men how to deconstruct the messages they're seeing and to develop a more realistic and healthy view of sex and relationships.
So media literacy is key here.
Absolutely. It's about helping them understand that porn is a fantasy world, not a reflection of reality. And it's about encouraging them to seek out alternative sources of information about sex and relationships. Books, websites, trusted adults.
It's about giving them the tools to think critically and to make informed choices about their own media consumption.
Exactly. And it's about having open and honest conversations about sex and relationships. We need to create spaces where young men feel comfortable talking about their concerns, their desires, and their experiences.
So parents, educators, mentors, we all have a role to play in fostering these conversations.
Absolutely. And it's not just about talking to young men. It's also about talking to young women. They need to be equipped with the knowledge and skills to challenge harmful stereotypes and to advocate for their own needs and boundaries.
So it's a collective effort. We need to create a culture where open and honest conversations about sex and relationships are the norm, not the exception. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of the complexities of online porn and its impact on individuals and society.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you. I think it's important to emphasize that while porn itself isn't inherently good or bad, it's crucial to be aware of the potential risks and benefits, and to approach it with a critical and informed mindset.
And to remember that there's no shame in seeking help if you're struggling with your own relationship with porn.
Absolutely. There are resources available, and you don't have to go through this alone.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, plenty to think about. Remember, this is an ongoing conversation, and there's always more to learn and explore. So keep those critical thinking caps on and stay curious. Until next time, keep diving deep